discussion series called Temples. Now, you may be thinking, well, why is it called temples? Let's just jump right into what we mean by the term temples so we can wrap our mind around. And that's really what this first week is going to be, kind of like just setting the stage for the rest of the discussions. We're just kind of get all of ourselves individually kind of understanding our place in this discussion this week, and I think it's going to be very, very important. So when we say temples for this series, for the purpose of this series, we're talking about the structures and or systems that hold our identity, affections, comforts, beliefs, and worldview. The container that holds your identity, the thing that you've been, the things that you've been collecting, right? Like whether it's your education, the tribes, the people groups that you feel that you're a part of. And we've all spent our lives constructing these things, right? The things that we consider important or most important, the thing that maybe that we're most willing or quick to argue about on social media, right? Like that's your temple. You want to know what's inside someone's temple. You criticize something about them and how quickly they begin to defend that thing with every ounce of who they are. You can tell, oh, that's the thing that's inside of their temple. That's in their container. I touched on an identity marker in their life. And we all have these. And we've spent our lives building this. And so when we talk about spending our lives building this, we have to think of our two halves of our lives, if you will. So it goes like this. There's the life that we're building because that's the life that we want or is expected, right? Like we grow up and we're given a worldview, usually from these people that are supposed to love and care about us, like right out of the gate. They're known as our parents. Most of us kind of had them in one way or another. We had some kind of adults in our life that were handing us a worldview and a lens with which to see the world. And for many of us, like that was a good thing. We liked it. It worked. It worked for us. You know, maybe you don't do things exactly like your parents do now as an adult, or maybe you're finding your own way. You're kind of, you know, in high school or college, and you're starting to see, okay, I think I believe these things, or I think I know this thing, and maybe certain assumptions are challenged, but you're kind of maybe making your walls higher to your temple, or you're widening them a little bit. But basically, the first half of life, and this isn't chronological. Okay, this has to do with immaturity and maturity. It has to do with our temple and what it actually looks like. And so there's that first half of life. And some people spend their entire life building that life that they are expected to have. Building that life they've always wanted. That American dream, maybe. You know, the house, the spouse, the 2.5 kids, the dog. Unless you're a cat person for some reason. I'm a neither. But that first half of life, right? And a lot of people, there's people who are 60, 70 years old, and that's where they are. Okay? And then there's this other thing. This is building the life that we're actually meant to live. Caring about the things that we're supposed to care about. Like highlighting the things that we're supposed to highlight. Living in our purpose, in our gifting, in our passion. There's that second half of life. And again, there's people 10 years old that get this, right? Now maybe they've lived some life. Maybe they're 10 years old and they have cancer, right? And they've seen things, they've been through it, but they get here. So it has nothing to do with age. It's about maturity. It's about the way we see the world. It's about the way we see ourselves. And there's two halves of life. And Richard Rohr, in his book, Falling Upward, says most of us are never told that we can set out from the known and the familiar, that first half of life, to take on a further journey. And this next part is important. Our institutions and our expectations, including our churches. Including our churches. And I would say especially our churches. Especially our churches And we're speaking from, as Americans, churches in America and the wide range of the types of churches that are there. But our institutions and expectations, including our churches, are almost entirely configured to encourage, support, reward, and validate the tasks of the first half of life. To build a tribe and say, this is me, this is who I am, to dig in regardless of what comes at you in life, even when it doesn't work out anymore the way you see the world, you dig in, or you get yourself in an echo chamber. Most churches are echo chambers, right? You want to be validated in the way you see the world, and the way you see God, and the way you see others. It's one of the big things we want to do differently in this church is I am not here to validate your views. I am here to challenge them and then for us to converse together and to wrestle with the important things of life. Because in an echo chamber, we don't grow. We don't move to a second half of life. We don't move into maturity. And so all of us have this. Now, some of us have these things when it comes to faith, and then maybe some of us don't. Maybe you kind of gave up the whole faith aspect at a different point in your life. And that's not an aspect of it. But there are those things, whether it's your politics or your education or just your worldview in general, you have those things that are deep inside you. And so maybe you're at a church today and you think, well, I'm here, but I'm not really into the whole God or faith thing. This discussion is going to hit into every aspect of all of our lives. And so I think it's going to be really applicable to all of us. And so I would just ask you to engage with us in this, no matter where you are. And really, here's what we're going to be talking about through this whole series, is this right here. A temple open to the world and fully mature is possible when we are willing to chip away at what is and build what could be. When we're willing to look at what is and evaluate it and assess it and challenge it, something lies on the other side of that. Now, I'll say this as well. Sometimes we can do this actively and we can embrace this process and we can actively participate in this process that's happening in all of our lives. Or sometimes it just happens to us, right? And we're going to talk about that more next week. Now, the reason we called this series Temples is because when you look into the Old Testament and the New Testament, it has a few things to say about temples. In the Old Testament, there was a temple, and there was this thing called a tabernacle, and we see that in ancient life, temples were kind of the center of life. And so we're going to reach back into some ancient things, some ancient wisdom, and we're going to look at what Jesus eventually says about temples and tabernacles. And I think it's going to be very interesting. Again, even if you're maybe not a Jesus person, you look at what he says and we look at it, it's a picture of all of life and what I think God is doing. And maybe you're uncomfortable with the word God, but all of what life is it's happening to us all of the time. So let's look at the Old Testament temple. So the whole thing started off with this thing called a tabernacle, not a temple, okay? And the tabernacle was like portable church, if you will, right? It was a portable worship thing because the children of Israel, they had left Egypt where they were in slavery, right? They were human doings, not human beings. Their worth was about how many bricks they made. And then we see that God rescues them. He pulls them out of this. And they end up in the wilderness, though, because God wants to take them to a place that he wants them to be. It was often referred to as the promised land, but they had problems living into that promise. And so God takes this generation and they wander, but he gives them in the wilderness a plan for a place to worship. And so you have the tabernacle here. And as you can see, this is the size of a football field right here in America. And this is about what the temple would be for the tabernacle. Pretty small, pretty insignificant, but it would have been in the middle of the camp. And the idea was, you could come into here. This is where people would kind of make their sacrifices. There's various slaughter tables here, and then there's the grill, right? I mean, that was like the brazen altar. It's where the fire was. It's where they would cook the meat, and that's really what was going on. I mean, if you look into the Old Testament, you look at some of the you get into Leviticus. I'm sure that's been fascinating reading for all of you. You see blood and fire. These priests, these people, they are butchers, right? They know how to take apart, and there's instructions on how to take apart an animal and to throw it on the fire. And it actually says that the smoke that came up was a pleasing smell to God. Something me and God have in common, right? The smell of barbecue is a pleasing smell. And so, here's kind of where they would clean up, and then this part actually right here is the tabernacle. So this is the tabernacle, or just tent, and there were 2 rooms in the tent. There was the place where the priest could go, and then there was the place where only the high priest could go, right? So it was the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. And then sometimes he would go in and he would die. They actually put bells on the bottom of his garments, so that if the bells quit ringing, they also like tied a rope to his ankle, and so he'd go in, if the bells quit ringing, they would drag him out, right? And he would go in and he would do the work of the priests, all kind of went on in there, but people couldn't go in there, just the priest. And then into the other room was just the high priest. But this was kind of this, be put in the center of the campgrounds, and this was the tabernacle. It was the very first thing that the Hebrew people began to use as worship as they were this nation called out of Egypt. And then moved on to this. You have eventually some kings raise up. You had King David. Maybe a lot of people are familiar with David and Goliath. So David had a son whose name was Solomon, and it was his job during his reign as king of Israel to build a temple. And so again, it's going to be a little bit bigger, but still not quite as big as like a football field, but still pretty big. And so we see this temple again. You have the courtyard, so there's no outer gates, if you will, but there's the courtyard here, and people could all come here, but you couldn't go into this area. So here's where people would kind of do their offerings. They would prepare it all, but again, the priests would go in here, but this was bigger, it was taller, it was more sturdy, and this was the temple of God. And I would say the temple of their God, because they viewed that their God was higher than all of the rest of the gods, as many ancient cultures did. So there's almost this idea of, every culture has a God. Every culture has a temple. Every culture has a place of worship, and so do we. And so they made it this very elaborate place. And this was Solomon's temple, and this is a big deal. But eventually, it was destroyed by the Babylonians. So fast forward to just before. So you're kind of going just before the Common Era, right? Just before like 1. So you're going to go before that. You're going to speak of this guy by the name of Herod the Great, and he's going to convert to Judaism, because he actually becomes the king of the Jews. Like, wait, isn't that Jesus, right? It's like, yeah, because that was something that they referred to as Jesus, but Herod actually had that. The person who ruled over where the Jewish people were would carry that title, King of the Jews, which is why when someone referred to Jesus as King of the Jews, it was actually very offensive to the empire. And so Herod begins this temple about 18 BCE. It's finished around 60 CE, and then it is completely destroyed in 70 CE. So, but the actual, like this part right here, the most holy place right here where all the priests did their stuff, was built early on, and then they just kept building around it. They just made this temple bigger and bigger and bigger and more elaborate. And how did they do that? How did they build a temple so elaborate? Well, it was off the backs of the people. Right? The people were already viewed this place as it sat in Jerusalem. It was the center of everything that they knew. It was the center of their life. Right? Jerusalem was important because the temple was there. This was their construct. This was every bit of identity for a Jewish person laid in here. And I think there's something just fascinating as you look at this, it gets bigger, because now here's a football field and here's the temple. Massive building project. This was actually part of Herod the Great's like MO, and then like it was finished after he died. Into the project, it was continued by the next ruler. But that was his MO, was to build things and as like tribute to Caesar. And so this is known as his temple, or the second temple. And it's interesting that so Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish, they could come to the steps and to the front, so like this courtyard, right? And then there was a place the women could come here. You know, you got to come in, but just kind of only a little bit. And there were various chambers for things. If you were a leper, which was a skin-eating, flesh-eating disease, you could come to the temple, but you had to come in this room with all the other lepers. And you see kind of, I think it's interesting, you go to the tabernacle, there was this big thing, and there were like 2 rooms, and then the temple is a little more, and then this is a little more, right? Like the divisions have grown. I think when you look at it, you have kind of in this center, right? The Holy of Holies, this is where God is, and then around where God is, there's various divisions. And this is very important to the Hebrew people. This is very important. This temple, this construct, this way of thinking, this way of living, this identity was everything to them. Now, I know what you're thinking. The point of this series is to get everybody, right, to move all your identity and or wherever God is in your identity and to move God to the center of your life, right? No. The point of this series, and I hope that you'll engage with us, and I hope that you'll invite people and bring them into this conversation. The point of this series is for us to turn our temples completely inside out. That's the process. That's what we're going to do, and it's because I believe that's what Jesus was calling the world to do, was to turn our temples completely inside out, our identities inside out. And how did he refer to this? Was love God and love others. Because these kind of divisions don't scream, I love you, to people. So, let's jump in to a letter to Hebrew Christians that was written, and actually just before, only about 2 or 3 years before this temple would be completely destroyed. And it's going to refer to the tabernacle, and this letter is going to refer to the temples, which is why I wanted us to kind of look at that and review that and think about ourselves and our identities as temples that have all of these divisions. Okay? Let's look at what it says in Hebrews. And this was written just before the second temple was destroyed. This is an anonymous letter. Most people believe it was maybe you've heard of the guy Paul, the Apostle Paul, or Saint Paul, who started a lot of churches and was this missionary that wrote most of the New Testament. I personally don't believe it was him because his ministry was to Gentiles. It was to people who weren't Jewish, and so I don't think it was him. And there's all kinds of speculation of who it could be. But this was written by a Jewish Christian leader, written to Jewish Christians. And so we're going to try and understand their culture a little bit by those talks about tabernacles and temples, and we're going to jump into this conversation that this writer is having with the audience. It says this: the first covenant between God and Israel, which was, and when we talk about the first covenant, you can also look at that as the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. That was the first covenant that God had with Israel. And in Genesis 12 is like the first time that we see that covenant between God and Abraham made. It said it had regulations for worship and a place of worship here on earth. And that place was the tabernacle. There were 2 rooms in that tabernacle. In the first room were a lampstand, a table, interesting, and sacred loaves of bread on the table. Pretty important. This room was called the holy place. And then there was a curtain, and behind that curtain was the second room called the most holy place. In that room were a gold and incense altar and a wooden chest called the Ark of the Covenant, which was covered with gold on all sides. Inside the Ark were, and maybe you've seen Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Inside the ark were a gold jar containing manna, which was bread that was provided by God when they were in the wilderness. Aaron's staff that sprouted leaves. This was a miracle recorded in the Old Testament. He had a wooden stick that wasn't connected to a source, but could sprout leaves and had life. And the stone tablets of the covenant. So the things that Moses had, the stone tablets that had the laws written on them that he carried down. And this was all inside the ark, which was covered with gold on all sides. Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that part. Above the ark were the cherubim, which is a type of angel. And this was like a golden statues, basically, that looked over the ark. the cherubim of divine glory, whose wings stretched out over the ark's cover, the place of atonement. And atonement there is a big Bible word that simply means like reparations for wrongdoing. So when they would sacrifice the animal, they would drain the blood, and they would pour the blood out as an offering of sacrifice for the sins of the people, and they would be atoned, or at least it would be there would be reparations made because of this sacrifice for a time. They had to do this over and over again, year after year. But we cannot explain all these things in detail now, kind of like I just did. When these things were all in place, the priests regularly entered the first room as they performed their religious duties, but only the high priest ever entered the most holy place, and only once a year. And he always offered blood for his own sins and for the sins of the people that the people had committed in ignorance. By these regulations, the Holy Spirit or Spirit of God revealed. So this had a purpose of it was built this way. This whole thing mattered because God was trying to show his people something. And here's what it revealed. This is very powerful. That the entrance to the most holy place was not freely open as long as the tabernacle and the system it represented were still in use. So again, we're thinking about our own temples, places where we are not open to the world, places where we are closed off. People that we don't like automatically because they don't fit in our tribe. They don't work with us. It doesn't fit. It's closed off. This first temple was like that, and there was a reason why it was like that. So it's the idea that your temple isn't necessarily a bad thing. Let's continue. This is an illustration pointing to the present time. For the gifts and sacrifices that the priests offer are not able to cleanse the consciences of the people who bring them. Okay? The idea is it's not open. It's not working. It's not a once and for all thing. This is a thing they're going to have to keep doing in the temple. And when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, it's never been built. There's never been a third temple. There is no place of worship for Jewish people. Jewish people do not worship the same way that they did then at this time. It had never been rebuilt. And he's saying that system wasn't able to do it. For that old system deals only with food and drink and various cleansing ceremonies, physical regulations that were in effect only until a better system could be established. So the worship was there, and it was a good thing, but it was all about physical, not as much spiritual. And then in what is marked as chapter 10 in this letter, because from here he's going to go on, he's going to talk about some more things, and then he's going to say this. He's going to kind of come back to this thought. The old system under the law of Moses was only a shadow, a dim preview of the good things to come, not the good things themselves. And I would say the same is true of our own temples and constructs that we have built in our life. They're a preview. It's like this: as a parent, I give my kids rules and regulations that hopefully they're still not following when they're adults. Right? Hopefully bedtime can be decided by them in maturity and is not 7:30 for the rest of their life, a hard line in the ground. Right? We all understand this as human beings, right? We understand this. And the same thing is here, is this system was in place. It was a good thing, but it was only a preview. It was only a shadow of the things to come. It was not the good things. So there was a good thing God was doing with the tabernacle and the temple, but now God is doing a better next thing through Jesus. Which brings us to our idea worth discussing. Unless we see our first temple as incomplete, we will ignore the possibility of something more. Unless we see it not as bad, not as evil, it's probably really good things. You know, one of the most important lessons I've learned in my life is that sometimes you have to say no or goodbye or you're gone to good things, maybe even to good people in your life, so that something better can come into your life. And if we don't see our first construct, again, the expectations that we're living into, that maybe other people have put on us, the things that we think we want, the way we've defined success, unless we're willing to see that as incomplete, very rarely will something better come into our life. Richard Rohr says it this way: the supposed achievements of the first half of life have to fall apart and show themselves to be wanting in some way, or we will not move further. Why would we? If it's good, he says this, and I think this is fascinating. One of his talks, he talks about that there's some of the best people he knows. There's some very well-adjusted adults, and successful by a lot of standards of definitions, are people who had very good parenting. There was a good structure built in their life. There was a way to live. There was a way to be in the world that worked for them. And they've just never challenged it, and they just keep living that way, or it's never been challenged for them, or if it is challenged, they dig in and they stick with it because for them it's very comfortable. It works. And so if it works, why would we do something different? If I like the way I view the world around me, if I like my identity, if I am comfortable, why, oh why would I challenge it? And I want to say this: because it's incomplete, and if we don't see it as incomplete, something more can never take place.